Hi, today I'm just going to do a quick video to talk about the best places to buy vintage clothes. I get asked all the time about my clothes and where I got them from, and it's not always obvious to people who've never worn vintage before where the best places to go are. First of all, you could just go to a vintage boutique. There's loads. A good place to find them. This is London specific, but I got this book recently called The Rough Guide to Vintage London, and this is absolutely packed with listings for shops and cafes and events and all sorts of good things in there. There's also a lot of websites, so it's worth just googling your area and searching for vintage shops. Another really good way to buy vintage is at vintage fashion fairs. I actually used to sell at vintage fashion fairs for a few years, and they're such a good place to meet people, and the quality of the stock there is amazing. It's also really nice to be able to meet the people selling it and find out as much as possible about each item, and also you can negotiate on price, obviously within reason, but most sellers are willing to take a little bit of money off, especially if you're buying more than one item, so it can't hurt to ask. One of my favourite things that I picked up at a vintage fair is this 1950s shirt dress, which I have worn in one of my blog posts, and this, I think it was marked at £50 and I paid £40 for it, and it's absolutely perfect, and that's probably cheaper than you would buy that sort of thing online, given that it is in perfect condition. The next really good place to buy vintage, obviously, is car boot sales. That's where I actually get most of mine. Now, not all car boot sales were created equal. Some are better than others, and it really is just a learning curve. Sometimes you'll go to a car boot sale that has 1,000 stalls and you won't find anything, so it's worth persevering. Other car boot sales that are more specialist in antiques, you'll find a lot more vintage clothing, but as I said, it's always worth persevering. One of my favourite ever car boot purchases is this early 1950s dress, which is a really soft cotton, which actually still needs quite a lot of repairs, so I haven't worn it yet, but I've had this for about a year now, and it's absolutely gorgeous, and this cost me £8, so it just goes to show what bargains there are out there, and it really doesn't need that much work given the price. And then there's eBay, of course. I recently bought this, which is a full skirted 1950s dress, which is an absolutely beautiful fabric. I think this cost me £40 on eBay, which for eBay isn't bad because vintage on eBay really isn't cheap anymore, so don't expect to find a bargain very often. They are there to be had, but you do need to persevere, and you can end up bidding yourself up quite high, so really keep an eye on it, and make sure you don't bid more than you should on some things, because people do tend to get in a frenzy and things go for more than they're worth. Probably for a dress like that I wouldn't have gone over 50, so I think that was fine. It does need a clean. Also, when shopping on eBay, my biggest advice would be always check your measurements. People who are selling don't always know exactly what the size is, so if the measurements aren't in the listing, ask. And the most important thing to do is just know your bust, waist and hip measurements and compare them against the clothes, and that will really help you make sure you don't make a mistake. Another great way of buying vintage clothes is actually to make them yourself. Now obviously they're not true vintage, but you can use a vintage fabric. I recently made myself this dress, and it's actually as good as a vintage dress. I used a vintage sheet to make it, and I managed to pick up in a charity shop an original metal zip. So all the parts that have gone into it are authentic vintage, and it is a vintage pattern. And that's a really nice way of getting something a bit more affordably. The fabric I think was £2.99 and the zip was 25p. The pattern was about £10, but obviously I can use that again and again, and I was just really thrilled with that, and that's something I'll wear a lot. Sewing doesn't have to be difficult. It is something you can teach yourself. It's worth picking up a book on sewing, some very, very easy beginners patterns. And I always say to people, look on YouTube for tutorials. There's a lot of the time people are making dresses, and it doesn't have to be the actual pattern you're sewing. Just watch them, as many as you can, and you'll really pick up what they're doing and how they're interpreting the pattern. And it is very easy to learn, and you don't need to buy an expensive sewing machine. You can get a second-hand one or a budget one. For simple dressmaking, you don't need anything elaborate. I'd say for a beginner, choose a very simple design and maybe something with no buttons, because that's obviously something else you have to learn. And basically just give it a go. It doesn't matter if you make loads of mistakes. Eventually you will be able to make your own dress, and it's a great way of having a wardrobe on a budget, having one-off items, and maybe being able to create something with a very vintage look that you wouldn't have otherwise had. Another great place to buy vintage is just vintage events in general. I went to the classic car boot sale last weekend, which was a very sort of British event with loads of classic cars, and it was a nice take on the traditional British car boot sale. Everything was sold out of classic cars, and everything on sale was vintage and homewares. A lot of events like that, which aren't necessarily car boot themed, sell vintage. So vintage music festivals, vintage transport festivals, there will always be somebody selling vintage clothes, and it's a really fun day out as well. So I've shown these on my blog already, but these are the dresses I picked up. Firstly, this really beautiful 50s cotton dress, which I'm absolutely in love with, and I got that for £30. And then this one, which is probably my new favourite vintage dress, and it has really pretty pockets, and this one cost me £40, so really not bad. Other places to buy vintage, Etsy. Etsy's really good. I have a dress from Etsy which is in the wash at the moment, so I couldn't include it in the video, but I did include it in a blog post last week, so you may have seen it. It's a pink gingham one. Often Etsy sellers are abroad in America. There aren't so many in the UK, although there are plenty. So it's often there are often quite large postage charges to send to the UK, but sometimes it's worth it, so I definitely recommend giving Etsy a go. Another thing that I've never done but I've been really looking into recently is buying your vintage clothes at auction. Kerry Taylor Auctions is probably the leading vintage fashion auctioneer in the UK, so I'll put a link to her below, and she has the most incredible couture in her auctions. But also there are bundles of more everyday vintage. Now you're looking at quite a big investment if you're buying at auction, so it's worth saving up for several months. I'd probably say for a large bundle of vintage clothes you could be looking at about £400, but you will get a lot in there. And you can always think about selling off some of the bits that you don't necessarily want from the bundle online, or doing a vintage fair or something like that, and just keeping your favourite bits. So it can be quite a good investment, but obviously you do need to go in with quite a lot of money. The other thing, if you're looking for vintage, ask relatives, elderly relatives. They may have vintage clothes in their attic that they're not using and they would really like to go to a new home. So it's always worth asking around. People are often happy to pass things on. You can always, you know, do something nice for them in return, like offer to do some cleaning in payment, or even give them some money. I know I got a lot of stuff from my grandmother, and it's really precious to me, so it's a nice way of getting some vintage clothes. It's always worth checking charity shops as well, and unfortunately there isn't that much vintage that makes it into charity shops anymore. It is harder to get, mainly because people know what they've got more now and they're more likely to sell it online. But it is always worth a try, especially for shoes and handbags and jewellery, that you're much more likely to find them than actual vintage clothing that with any age to it. And obviously if you like 70s and 80s and even 90s stuff, you will find loads of that in charity shops, so it's always worth a look. Anyway, I think that's everything. This has turned into quite a long video. But if you have any questions, please get in touch. You can just get in touch in the comments and I'm happy to answer anything. And I hope you found this video useful. Thank you. Bye.